They don't regret losing you the way you think. They regret who they became when they had you. Avoidants almost never experience regret in the moment. When the connection starts to feel real, their system doesn't pause to reflect, it reacts. Suppression comes first, distance comes first, logic comes first. Anything that creates emotional space feels safer than staying present. So instead of noticing what they're losing, they focus on what they think they're escaping. They convince themselves they need freedom, clarity, time, or independence, when what they're actually doing is silencing the part of themselves that feels too much. In that phase, regret isn't accessible to them. Their nervous system is in protection mode, not reflection mode. While you're still there, loving them, adjusting yourself, offering reassurance, they can't fully see you. Your consistency feels overwhelming. Your emotional availability feels invasive. Not because it is, but because closeness activates old survival wiring they've never questioned. So they downplay the connection. They tell themselves you're asking for too much, or that the timing is wrong, or that something feels off. That story helps them detach without having to confront the deeper truth that being loved requires a level of presence they don't yet know how to sustain. The regret only begins once the thread is gone. Once the relationship ends, once the pressure to respond or engage disappears, their body finally settles. And that's when something unexpected happens. In the quiet, without your energy regulating them, their system starts to notice what's missing. Not dramatically, not emotionally at first, but subtly. They realize they feel flatter, colder, less alive. The chaos they blamed you for is gone. Yet so is the warmth they didn't know they were receiving. That's when the realization creeps in. You weren't pressure. You weren't demanding. You weren't too much. You were safety they didn't know how to hold. You were offering consistency to a system that only knew unpredictability. You were offering closeness to someone whose body learned early that closeness comes with a cost. And instead of receiving it, they armored up. They pulled away. They became more distant, more self-focused, more avoidant than they had been before. This is the regret they rarely articulate out loud. It's not just about losing you, it's about recognizing too late that they abandoned a softer version of themselves to stay protected. They regret the emotional numbness they chose. They regret the moments they went silent instead of honest. They regret how disconnected they became while convincing themselves they were being strong or rational. But admitting that regret would mean admitting vulnerability. It would mean acknowledging that you mattered more than they allowed themselves to feel. And for an avoidant, that admission can feel more dangerous than the loss itself. So the regret stays internal, quiet, unspoken, living not as words, but as a lingering awareness that something real was mishandled and a version of themselves was lost along with you. An avoidant can't value love while they're still running from it. When you were present, responsive, emotionally available, it didn't land in their body as devotion. It landed as danger. Not because your love was wrong, but because their nervous system was trained to associate closeness with loss of control. To an avoidant, intimacy doesn't feel soothing at first. It feels invasive. It feels like something that might trap them, consume them, or expose parts of themselves they learned long ago to keep hidden. So while you were showing up with care, their system was quietly bracing for impact. This is why they couldn't appreciate you in real time. Appreciation requires safety, and safety for an avoidant often feels unfamiliar. They grew up learning how to be self-contained, how to rely on themselves, how to stay ahead of emotional need. When you offered consistency, attunement, and emotional availability, it contradicted the internal rulebook they survived by. Instead of feeling grateful, they felt dysregulated. Instead of feeling connected, they felt the urge to create space. So they minimized you, not in obvious, cruel ways, but subtly. They downplayed your importance in their life. They questioned the depth of the connection. They delayed commitment under the guise of needing time, clarity, or certainty. They acted indifferent in moments that called for emotional presence. All of this wasn't strategy, it was regulation. Distance helped them breathe, detachment helped them feel in control again. What hurts most is that from the outside, it looks like you weren't enough. like your love failed to inspire them to step forward. But the truth is more complex and far less personal. They weren't withholding appreciation because you lacked value. They were withholding it because closeness threatened their autonomy. To them, fully acknowledging how much you meant would have required leaning into dependency, vulnerability, and emotional risk. And those were things their system learned to avoid at all costs. They may have even convinced themselves that something was missing, that the spark wasn't strong enough, that the connection wasn't quite right. These thoughts weren't lies in the traditional sense, they were protective distortion. If they could frame the relationship as flawed, they could justify pulling away without confronting the deeper fear that staying would mean surrendering the independence that once kept them safe. The tragedy is that appreciation often comes only in hindsight. Once you were no longer there, no longer reaching, no longer adjusting, no longer offering emotional access, the danger signal faded, and in its place, something else emerged. They noticed the absence of your presence, the lack of emotional responsiveness, the silence where connection used to live, and only then did they begin to recognize what they couldn't see before. They didn't fail to appreciate you because you were unlovable. They failed because they were still running, not from you, but from the vulnerability that real love demands. Regret doesn't hit when you leave. It hits when you stop waiting. When the relationship first ends, avoidants rarely feel devastated. In fact, many of them feel relief. The space feels quiet, manageable, controlled. There are no emotional expectations to respond to, no need to explain themselves, no pressure to be present when their system is overwhelmed. To them, the distance feels like a return to equilibrium. This is why they often appear calm, detached, or even unaffected in the beginning. From the outside, it looks like they moved on easily. Internally, it feels like they finally regained control. But that relief is temporary. It's not healing, it's deactivation. Their nervous system has simply shut down the attachment response to reduce threat. And as long as they believe you're still emotionally available, still hoping, still waiting, still reachable, the sense of control remains intact. The connection may be paused, but it doesn't feel fully gone. The real shift happens quietly, it's often without warning. They notice you're no longer orbiting their emotional world. You stop checking in, you stop explaining your feelings, you stop reaching out to repair what they refuse to tend to. There's no confrontation, no dramatic goodbye, just absence. And that absence lands differently than a breakup ever could. This is the moment regret actually begins, not as a thought, but as a sensation. Their body starts to register a loss. It can't intellectualize away. The familiar regulation your presence provided is gone. The subtle emotional anchoring you offered without them realizing it disappears. And suddenly, the calm they felt turns into something colder, emptier, less stable. This is why the regret isn't emotional at first. It's biological. Their nervous system has lost an external regulator. You were helping them stay balanced without asking them to be fully vulnerable. Your consistency, your predictability, your emotional availability were quietly soothing their system. And once that's removed, their body notices the absence before their mind can make sense of it. They may feel restless, irritable, disconnected. Sleep may become lighter, focus more scattered. These aren't dramatic signs of heartbreak. They're signs of dysregulation. And because avoidants are conditioned to suppress emotional awareness, they don't immediately label this as missing you. They just know something feels off. Over time, that off becomes harder to ignore. They replay moments. They think about conversations they dismissed. They wonder why other connections don't feel the same. And slowly, the realization forms the loss wasn't just the relationship, it was the role you played in their emotional ecosystem. This is when regret takes root, not because you left, but because you stopped waiting. You removed yourself from a position that made them feel secure without ever having to show up fully. And once that access is gone, the loss becomes undeniable. For an avoidant, regret doesn't scream, it settles in quietly, deeply, as the body remembers what the mind once tried to escape. If they can't face the regret, they rewrite you as too much. Once regret begins to surface, it creates a new problem for the avoidant. Not about the relationship, but about identity. Regret brings shame And shame threatens the carefully constructed self-image they've relied on to survive. So instead of fully feeling the weight of what happened, they unconsciously rewrite the story of the past, not to hurt you, but to protect themselves from emotional collapse. This is where the reframing begins. You become needy, the relationship becomes unhealthy, the timing becomes wrong. They tell themselves and sometimes others that it wouldn't have worked anyway, that they weren't ready, that you wanted too much too soon. These narratives allow them to distance themselves from the pain of accountability, because if you are the problem, then they don't have to sit with the truth that they mishandled something real. If this isn't clarity, it's not growth, it's self-protection. Avoidants are often deeply uncomfortable with guilt, especially relational guilt. Admitting they hurt someone who genuinely loved them would force them to confront a version of themselves they don't know how to hold. It would mean acknowledging that their coping strategies, silence, withdrawal, emotional distance, had consequences. And for someone who learned early that emotional exposure leads to danger, that realization feels overwhelming. So the mind steps in to regulate what the heart can't process. They intellectualize, they rationalize, they focus on your reactions instead of their avoidance. They zoom in on moments where you expressed pain, frustration, or need, and use those moments as proof that the relationship was too much. This selective memory isn't malicious, it's defensive. It helps them avoid the deeper grief of recognizing how much you actually matter. What's rarely acknowledged is that this rewrite often conflicts with how they truly feel. On the surface, they appear resolved, detached, certain, but underneath, the regret still exists. Unresolved and unintegrated, the story they tell themselves is a shield, not a reflection of reality. And the more they repeat it, the more they distance themselves from the emotional truth they're afraid to touch. This is why you might feel confused by the shift. One moment, the connection felt meaningful and deep. The next, it's dismissed as incompatible or intense. But that shift says less about the relationship and more about their internal capacity to tolerate remorse. Rewriting the story allows them to maintain emotional distance without appearing cruel, even to themselves. Admitting the full truth would mean accepting that they were loved in a way they couldn't receive at the time, that they caused pain, not because they intended to, but because they were emotionally unavailable. And that kind of realization threatens the very identity they built to stay safe. So they rewrite, not because the past wasn't real, but because facing it fully would require a level of emotional honesty they're not yet ready to sustain. They don't miss you when they're alone. They miss you when someone else can't replace you. After the separation, many avoidants move on quickly, at least on the surface. They find someone new, often someone easier, and someone less emotionally demanding. Someone who doesn't ask for depth, clarity, or vulnerability. And at first, it feels like relief. The new relationship is calmer. There's less intensity, fewer emotional conversations, less pressure to show up fully. To the avoidant nervous system, this feels manageable, even peaceful. But calm isn't the same as connection. With a placeholder, life may feel smoother, but it's also flatter. There's no depth to sink into, no emotional resonance that lingers after conversations end, no mirror reflecting parts of themselves they didn't know existed. The relationship functions, but it doesn't transform. And at first, that feels like success. They tell themselves this is what a healthy relationship is supposed to feel like, until something subtle starts to surface. It happens in moments they don't expect. A conversation that stays shallow, a disagreement that resolves too easily because neither person truly engages, a silence that feels empty instead of safe. And slowly the comparison begins, not consciously, not deliberately, but instinctively. They realize something is missing that they can't quite name. That's when you reappear in their mind, not as a person they want to chase or confess to, but as a reference point, a standard. You become the emotional depth they can't recreate, the connection that asked more of them than they were able to give at the time. And this realization doesn't come with nostalgia. It comes with discomfort because it exposes the truth they tried to avoid, that they didn't lose you because the relationship was wrong, but because they couldn't meet it. What makes this regret particularly painful is that it emerges through contrast. The new partner isn't necessarily bad. They're just not you. They don't evoke the same emotional response. They don't challenge the avoidant's inner world. They don't require growth. And in that absence of challenge, the avoidant feels safe, but also unchanged. This is where regret deepens, not in longing, but in awareness. They see that what they once labeled as too much was actually depth. What they called pressure was intimacy. And what they replaced you with is compatibility without connection. Yet, even here, they rarely act on the regret. Reaching back would mean admitting that the easier choice came with a cost. It would mean acknowledging that the calm they prioritized also stripped the relationship of meaning. So instead, the regret stays internal, a quiet comparison they never voice. You don't haunt them because you were irreplaceable as a person. You haunt them because you represented a level of emotional truth they weren't ready to rise to. And every time a new connection fails to reach that depth, they're reminded not of you, but of the version of themselves they couldn't become when it mattered most. Regret doesn't always turn into an apology. Sometimes it turns into silence. For an avoidant, regret is complicated. It exists, but it doesn't naturally translate into words or actions. Apologizing requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is precisely what they learn to avoid. To reach out would mean opening the door to guilt, facing the impact of their choices, and confronting a truth they've long kept at arm's length, that they mishandled someone who genuinely loved them. That level of emotional honesty can feel unbearable, so their default response isn't confrontation, it's withdrawal. Silence becomes safer than confession, distance safer than accountability. In the quiet, they find a way to keep the regret alive without having to express it. They check your socials, quietly observe your life from afar, or ask about you indirectly through mutual contacts. They notice the little things, the way you've grown, the milestones you hit, the people who now surround you, and it stirs something that looks like longing, but isn't quite longing in the traditional sense. It's a recognition of loss coupled with self-preservation. Watching from afar hurts less than admitting, even to themselves, that they mishandled a love that was real. For many avoidants, apologies are almost impossible because they would shatter the carefully constructed identity they rely on. Saying I'm sorry requires admitting vulnerability, emotional failure, and accountability. Three things their nervous system often refuses to tolerate. Silence, on the other hand, allows them to contain the emotional storm. It allows them to preserve the image of control while the regret simmers quietly under the surface. They may never send a message, they may never make a gesture, but internally, they are replaying the past, weighing what they could have done differently, and experiencing the discomfort of loss without outwardly revealing it. The tragedy of this behavior is that it can feel like indifference from the outside. Friends, observers, or even the person they hurt may see only distance, coldness, or detachment. What they don't see is the invisible regret simmering beneath the biological reminder that something vital was lost. Your presence once regulated them emotionally, brought them stability, and created a closeness they were incapable of sustaining. That void now exists, and it registers at a level that goes beyond conscious thought. This is why their apology often takes the form of quiet observation rather than direct communication. It's not an excuse, nor is it cruelty, it's self-preservation. They know that direct acknowledgement could reopen emotional wounds too vast to handle. So they watch, they notice, and they internalize. In those silent observations, they feel the echo of what they lost, the weight of what they avoided, and the truth of the love they failed to fully receive and reciprocate. In the end, the avoidant rarely apologizes because the risk of emotional exposure outweighs the comfort of closure. Silence becomes their shield, observation their outlet, and regret their quiet companion, a companion that reminds them, every time they see what they cannot replace, of the love they mishandled and the person who remains unforgettable. They don't regret the relationship. They regret losing access to the version of themselves you brought out. Avoidants rarely look back and wish the relationship itself had been different. Their minds don't dwell on the shared moments, the fights, or even the endings in isolation. What lingers long after the distance has been created is the sense of loss for the part of themselves that only existed when you were there. You didn't just love them, you regulated them. You softened the edges, they had sharpened for protection. You offered emotional consistency they weren't used to, and in doing so, you brought out a version of themselves that felt alive, grounded, and fully human. This is why when you are no longer present, they feel colder than before. It's not just about missing your presence. It's about missing themselves. They feel the absence of the emotional safety you created, the quiet steadiness you offered, and the mirror of your care that reflected a more open, softer, and accessible self. They are confronted with contrast, the person they are without you versus the person they could be with you. And that contrast is uncomfortable, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. Regret, in this sense, is not about the relationship in the conventional way. It isn't about wishing they hadn't left or hoping for reconciliation. It's biological. It lives in the nervous system rather than the conscious mind. They remember how it felt to be regulated by your presence, to be emotionally mirrored, to feel safe while still being seen fully. That memory exists as a kind of warmth, and its absence is profoundly noticeable. The warmth wasn't transactional or conditional. It was intrinsic to the connection you shared. Losing it awakens the truth. They didn't just lose you, they lost the emotional ecosystem that allowed them to thrive. This lingering regret is particularly insidious because it can't be neatly expressed. There's no apology that captures it fully, no action that restores it. They may try to distract themselves with new connections, distractions, or busy routines, but nothing can replicate the subtle regulation, the gentle grounding, and the humanizing effect you had. And over time, even the calmest, most self-contained avoidant notices it in moments of quiet and comparisons with others, in flashes of longing that make no sense on the surface. Ultimately, this is why some avoidants carry regret quietly for years, not because they wish they could change the past, but because they can't replace the effect you had on them. They remember the way you made them feel, the steadiness you offered, and the reflection of themselves you unlocked. And no matter how much distance, distraction, or avoidance they employ, that memory lingers, haunting every connection that comes afterward. The deepest truth is this: they don't regret losing you. They regret losing access to the version of themselves that only existed when you were there. And that is a form of loss that doesn't fade. It lives quietly, biologically, and undeniably long after everything else has ended. An avoidant doesn't regret hurting you immediately. They regret it when it's irreversible. Avoidants rarely experience immediate regret after causing pain. In the moment, their nervous system prioritizes self-preservation over reflection. Distance, withdrawal, and detachment feel like solutions, not problems. They justify their actions, suppress the discomfort, and convince themselves that stepping back was necessary. At first, regret is distant, muted, almost non-existent. They may even feel relief, believing that avoiding vulnerability keeps them safe. The true weight of loss, however, comes much later, in the silence after the opportunity to repair has vanished. Regret only emerges once you've healed, once you've detached, once you've stopped waiting for explanations, apologies, or reconnections. When you no longer reach, no longer hope, and no longer adjust yourself to accommodate their avoidance. The avoidant can no longer manipulate proximity to control the narrative. That's when the realization settles in. It's not loud, dramatic, or immediate. It arrives slowly, quietly, like a shadow creeping into the edges of their awareness. They begin to notice what's missing, not just your presence, but the version of life, of connection, and of themselves that only existed when you were there. They didn't lose you because love failed. They lost you because they were afraid of what love required. The consistency, vulnerability, and emotional intimacy you offered demanded something of them they weren't ready to give. Love in its truest form asks for presence, surrender, and risk. And these are exactly the things avoidants fear. So instead of engaging fully, they withdrew. And once the space was created, once the emotional distance widened, the opportunity to experience what you offered fully became impossible to reclaim. This is why some regrets never turn into apologies or confessions. They live quietly, unspoken, lodged deep in the nervous system, rather than expressed verbally. Avoidants feel the absence, the void, the shift in emotional gravity, but articulating it would mean exposing vulnerability they've long avoided. Instead, the regret manifests subtly, in moments of comparison, in failed relationships, in the recognition that no one else evokes the same depth or resonance. It's in every connection that never feels, like you again. It's in the memory of the warmth they no longer have access to, in the silence where they once had emotional closeness. Ultimately, this final truth is both haunting and revealing. The pain caused by avoidance is not merely about the lost relationship. It's about the irreversible opportunity to experience connection in a way they were incapable of sustaining. You are not regretted for what you demanded or what you gave. You are regretted because the depth you offered exposed a fear they couldn't overcome at the time. Some regrets aren't loud. They don't come with confrontation or confession. They exist quietly, persistently, and biologically. They live in the gaps of their current connections, in the comparisons they can't escape, and in the memory of what they let go. And that is the truth avoidants only realize when it's too late, when the love that once existed cannot be reclaimed, and the person who offered it has moved beyond waiting.